So, back in June of 1977, there was this Girl Scout counselor who woke up really early one morning to beat the rush to the showers. She's walking down this trail through the woods, probably half asleep, when she sees something weird up ahead. She saw three sleeping bags just sitting there on the path stacked on top of each other. Now, if you've ever been to summer camp, you know kids do weird stuff. Maybe they got scared during the storm the night before and tried to drag their sleeping bags closer to the main camp. Makes sense, right? So she walks over and unzips the top sleeping bag to see what's going on. What she found inside changed everything. Not just for her, not just for that camp, but for how parents across the entire country thought about sending their kids to summer camp. Because inside those sleeping bags were three little girls, and they were dead. This is the story of what happened at Camp Scott in Oklahoma, a case that would launch one of the biggest manhunts in the state's history, terrorize parents nationwide, and remain unsolved for over 40 years until DNA technology finally revealed the truth. And that truth? Well, it's somehow both exactly what you'd expect and completely shocking at the same time. If you find this kind of story interesting, a like and a sub really helps. Now, let's begin. All right, so let me set the scene for you. Camp Scott was this beautiful Girl Scout camp about an hour outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. We're talking 410 acres of pure summer camp paradise. There's a creek running through it, tons of trees, and these platform tents scattered around the property. Now, if you don't know what a platform tent is, picture a regular camping tent, but way bigger and built on a raised wooden platform. They're like the fancy version of tent camping. Not quite a cabin, but definitely a step up from sleeping on the ground. The camp had been around for almost 50 years by 1977, and it was getting ready to celebrate its golden anniversary. This place was legit. It was considered one of the best Girl Scout camps in Oklahoma. But here's the thing about the layout that's going to become really important later. The tents were organized into these little clusters called units, and each unit was named after a Native American tribe. You had Cherokee, Comanche, Quapaw, and Kiowa. Most of these units were set up so the counselors could keep an eye on all the tents from their own tent. Makes sense, right? But the Kiowa unit was different. See, Kiowa had this one tent, tent number 8, that was way back in the woods, kind of hidden behind the shower building. You couldn't see it from the counselor's tent. It was isolated, quiet, and honestly, if you were up to no good, it would be the perfect place to do something terrible without being seen or heard. Now, here's where this story gets really messed up, because what happened to these girls could have been prevented. A few weeks before the murders, the camp was doing staff training. You know, getting all the counselors ready for the summer season. One of the counselors brought a box of donuts, because who doesn't love donuts, right? So she left them with her stuff while she went to do some training activities. When she came back, the donuts were gone. Annoying, but not the end of the world. Except in place of the donuts, there was a note. And this note said that 3 Girl Scouts were going to be murdered. Let me say that again. Someone had been watching this camp, had gotten close enough to steal food, and had left a specific threat saying 3 Girl Scouts were going to be killed. The counselor immediately showed this note to the camp directors. And what did they do? They said it was probably just a prank and threw the note away. They just threw it away. I want you to remember this part because later, when families are asking how this could have happened, this is going to be a huge part of the conversation. So June 12th, 1977 rolls around. It's a Sunday, and honestly, the weather's kind of crappy, misty and gray with rain clouds building up. But that doesn't matter to the girls getting off those buses because they're about to start their week at Girl Scout camp. The 3 girls who ended up in tent 8 were Lori Farmer, who was 8 years old, Michelle Goose, who was 9, and Denise Miller, who was 10. Just normal kids, excited about their first night at camp. They got assigned to the Kiowa unit, specifically to that isolated tent 8 I mentioned earlier. And honestly, they probably thought they were lucky. Their tent was quieter, more private, tucked away in the woods like their own little hideaway. The evening started out quite well. They did archery, went swimming, and made s'mores around the campfire. All the classic camp stuff. The girls were getting to know each other, probably staying up later than they should have been, whispering and giggling the way kids do on their first night away from home. But then the weather turned nasty. That misty drizzle became a full-on thunderstorm, and all the outdoor activities got shut down. The counselors rushed everyone back to their tents. The girls settled in for the night in Tent 8, listening to the rain pounding on the canvas above them. They had no idea that someone was out there in that storm, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What happened next is honestly so hard to talk about, but it's important to understand just how calculated and brutal this attack was. Sometime in the middle of the night, while the storm was still raging, someone cut through the back of Tent 8. They came prepared. They had tools, they had a plan, and they knew exactly what they were doing. The killer sexually assaulted all 3 girls, beat them with a flashlight, and strangled them to death. Then, and this is what shows you how cold and calculating this person was, they loaded the bodies into sleeping bags and carried them about 150 yards away from the tent to dump them on that trail. Think about that for a second. While other campers and counselors were sleeping just hundreds of yards away, this monster was moving through the woods in the middle of a thunderstorm, carrying the bodies of 3 children. The storm provided perfect cover. The rain washed away evidence, and the thunder masked any sounds. It was like the worst possible night for something like this to happen. The next morning, June 13th, that counselor I mentioned earlier at the beginning decided to get up early and beat the rush to the showers. She's walking down this trail, probably thinking about what a beautiful morning it was after such a terrible storm. And that's when she sees the sleeping bags. I can't imagine what went through her mind in that moment. Her screams echoed through the forest that morning. Within minutes, the entire camp was in chaos. Counselors were running around, trying to figure out what was happening. The remaining campers were confused and scared. Camp Scott was immediately evacuated. All 140 girls and staff members were loaded onto buses and sent home. What was supposed to be a week of fun and friendship was over before it really began. The response was massive. We're talking Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, FBI, local sheriff's departments. Everyone descended on Camp Scott. This wasn't just a local crime anymore. 3 children had been brutally murdered at what was supposed to be the safest place for the children. The forensics team went to work with everything they had in 1977. They brought in tracking dogs, processed the crime scene, and collected evidence. And what they found painted a picture of someone who had planned this attack very carefully. They found a single fingerprint on the lens of the flashlight that was used to beat the girls. There was blood evidence throughout Tent 8. And most importantly, they found a clear footprint in the blood, a size 9 men's shoe. But there was something else that suggested this wasn't just some random attack. A guy who lived near the camp reported hearing a lot of traffic on the back roads between 2:30 and 3 in the morning. Now, this was a really remote area, so hearing multiple vehicles at that time of night was weird. The manhunt that followed was one of the biggest in Oklahoma history. Tips were pouring in from everywhere. Every registered sex offender in a 100-mile radius was investigated. And slowly, investigators started focusing on one particular suspect. His name was Gene Leroy Hart, and he was already a legend in that part of Oklahoma. And it's not the good kind of legend. Gene Hart was the kind of guy who would have been a folk hero if he wasn't such a dangerous criminal. He was Cherokee, born and raised in the area around Camp Scott. His childhood home was literally about a mile from where the murders happened. By 1977, Hart was already serving a 308-year prison sentence for rape and burglary. But the thing is, he wasn't actually in prison. He had escaped from the Mays County Jail 4 years earlier and had been living as a fugitive ever since. And not just any fugitive. Hart had become something of a Cherokee Robin Hood figure to some people in the community. He knew those woods like the back of his hand, and he had been successfully evading one of the biggest manhunts in Oklahoma history. The crimes he had been convicted of were disturbing and violent. He had raped 2 pregnant women in attacks that were similar in some ways to what happened at Camp Scott. The sheriff at the time, Pete Weaver, was absolutely convinced Hart was their guy. He said he was 1,000% certain of Hart's guilt. The circumstantial evidence seemed overwhelming. Hart knew the area intimately. He had a history of violent sexual assault. He was already a fugitive who would do anything to avoid capture, and he had the skills to disappear into the wilderness after committing a crime. But there were problems with the case against Hart. Big problems. Remember that footprint they found in the blood? The size of the men's shoe? Well, Hart's feet were smaller than that. And while you can change a lot of things to hide your identity during a crime, you can't change your shoe size. There were other inconsistencies too. Hart's previous crimes, while violent, were more opportunistic. The Girl Scout murders showed a level of planning and brutality that didn't quite fit his pattern. But the biggest problem was that despite the massive manhunt, Hart was still out there. For 10 months after the murders, he evaded capture. Federal agents, state police, local sheriffs, tracking dogs, and even helicopters. They threw everything at finding this one guy, and he stayed one step ahead of them. Hart wasn't just lucky. He was getting help from people in the Cherokee community who saw him as a symbol of resistance against a system that had oppressed their people for generations. To them, he wasn't a criminal. They saw him as someone who was fighting back against white authority. Hart was finally captured in April 1978, almost exactly 10 months after the murders. It took a carefully coordinated raid involving multiple agencies to finally corner him. They found him hiding in the home of a Cherokee medicine man, and even then, his capture was a huge operation. Hart had been living in the community, protected by people who somehow believed in him. His arrest made national headlines. After nearly a year of fear and speculation, authorities finally had their suspect. The families of the victims, the people of Oklahoma, and everyone who had been following this case all thought justice was finally within reach. But having a suspect and proving guilt in court are two completely different things. Hart's trial in 1979 was a circus. The national media were there, the courtroom was packed, and everyone was waiting to see if the Cherokee outlaw would finally pay for what everyone assumed he had done. The prosecution laid out their case, Hart's criminal history, his knowledge of the area, and other various pieces of circumstantial evidence. They painted him as a dangerous predator who had finally escalated to murder, but his defense team focused on those problems I mentioned earlier. The footprint that didn't match, the lack of direct physical evidence, and they also argued that law enforcement was so desperate to solve this high-profile case that they had targeted Hart without sufficient proof. And here's the thing. The jury actually bought it. After deliberating, they came back with a verdict of not guilty. Can you just imagine what that felt like for the families? After nearly 2 years of grief, of believing that the person who killed their daughters was finally going to be held accountable, they just watched him walk away from the murder charges. Hart didn't actually walk away free. He still had that 308-year sentence hanging over his head. He went back to prison, where he died of a heart attack just 2 months later, in June 1979. For more than 40 years, the case remained officially unsolved. The families never gave up fighting for answers, though. They sued the Girl Scout organization, arguing that the ignored death threat and the isolated location of Tent 8 showed negligence. They unfortunately lost that lawsuit too. Decades passed. The counselors who were there that night grew up, got married, and had kids of their own. The families of the victims kept pushing for new investigations, new evidence, anything that might finally give them closure. And then DNA technology changed everything. In 2008, biological evidence from the crime scene was tested using more advanced DNA techniques. The results were interesting but not conclusive. They suggested Hart could have been involved, but the evidence was too degraded to be certain. But technology kept improving. In 2022, nearly 45 years after the murders, Mayes County Sheriff Mike Reed called a press conference that would finally answer the question that had haunted Oklahoma for decades. Sheriff Reed announced that new DNA testing, using the most advanced techniques available, had provided definitive answers. The DNA evidence strongly implicated Gene Leroy Hart as the killer. Not just implicated, according to Sheriff Reed, unless something new comes up, something brought to light we are not aware of. I am convinced where I'm sitting of Hart's guilt and involvement in this case. The testing had ruled out every other potential suspect. Additional evidence was discovered, including the tape found on the flashlight that closely matched tape found in a cave near Hart's childhood home, a cave where he had been known to hide during his years as a fugitive. All those people who had been 1,000% certain of Hart's guilt back in 1977, they were right. The jury in 1979 had acquitted him because the evidence wasn't strong enough at the time. But with modern DNA technology, the truth finally came out. Gene Leroy Hart killed Lori Farmer, Michelle Goose, and Denise Miller. The Cherokee outlaw, the folk hero, the man who had evaded justice for so long. He was exactly what law enforcement had always said he was, a monster. Camp Scott never reopened after June 13th, 1977. The Girl Scouts decided that the camp would forever be associated with tragedy, and they were probably right. If you go there today, and yes, you can still visit the property, you'll find the building slowly being reclaimed by nature. The swimming pool is filled with mud and leaves. The dining hall is falling apart. Nature is slowly erasing what was once Oklahoma's premier Girl Scout camp. The spot where Tent 8 stood, it's completely gone. The platform has rotted away. The tent has long since decomposed, and now there are just trees growing where 3 little girls spent their last night alive. But their story hasn't been forgotten. Lori, Michelle, and Denise were just kids who wanted to go to summer camp and have fun. They deserved to grow up, to have their own families, to live full lives. Instead, they became the victims of a crime that changed how we think about child safety, that terrorized parents across the country, and that remained unsolved for over 4 decades. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders remind us that monsters are real, that evil can strike anywhere, and that sometimes the campfire stories that seem too scary to be true are actually based on something much worse than fiction. But this case also shows us that justice, while sometimes delayed, isn't always denied. Technology, persistence, and families who refuse to give up can eventually bring answers, even decades later. Lori Farmer was 8, Michelle Goose was 9, and Denise Miller was 10. They went to camp excited about making friends and having adventures. They deserved so much better than what they got. But finally, after 45 years, they got justice. And maybe that's something. If you want to hear more stories like this one, hit that subscribe button. There are more cases out there, more families still looking for answers, and more mysteries that need to be told. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the things that go bump in the night are more real than we want to believe.